Everyone, welcome to Hudson Institute. My name's Nate Sibley. I'm a fellow here. I run something called the Kleptocracy Initiative, looking at how authoritarian corruption is reshaping global politics. For those of you joining us for the first time online, Hudson Institute is a 501c3 nonpartisan think tank focused on US foreign policy and national security, advocating strong American global leadership for a secure, free, and prosperous future. Today, I run the Kleptocracy Initiative. We're talking about Venezuela, which should, of course, be the wealthiest country in South America, but for decades of socialist mismanagement and rampant corruption, which have instead given rise to what is arguably, pound for pound, the world's worst kleptocracy. Something people often think Russia is, but I think when I look at the effects of kleptocracy on a society, I think Venezuela is really up there. Nicolas Maduro has created a criminal hybrid state in which corrupt political elites have plundered the country's oil wealth and its public assets. Narcotrafficking has become an official state business, and the regime is now openly working alongside brutal criminal gangs to maintain control of the streets and target the opposition. Nor are these activities confined within Venezuela's borders, with reports of transnational repression by Maduro's thugs on the rise, including many such incidents here on US soil. Standing behind him are Cuba, China, Iran, Russia, who continue to provide the regime with security assistance and sanctions evasion capabilities in return for a foothold for themselves in South America. Now, most recently, Maduro's refusal to concede defeat in Venezuela's recent presidential election has plunged the country into a new spiral of political repression and economic crisis. Just this weekend, we learned that Edmundo Gonzalez, the legitimately elected and now ejected president of Venezuela, has been forced into exile in Spain after being targeted for arrest, apparently perhaps in retaliation for the seizure of Maduro's private jet by US law enforcement on sanctions evasion charges. Joining me to discuss the implications of all this for US Venezuela policy, I'm lucky to have some great experts today. Next to me is Ryan Berg. He's the director of the Americas Program and head of the Future of Venezuela Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Next to him is Maria Alejandra Marquez, Venezuelan American journalist and co-founder of the Venezuelan Asset Recovery Initiative, known as INRAV, which looks at ways to safeguard the assets that are seized by US law enforcement so they can be used for the future benefit of the Venezuelan people. And then last is our own senior fellow from Hudson here, Marshall Billingsley. Many senior roles in government throughout his time, but most relevant perhaps for our purposes today, served under President Trump as Assistant Secretary for Terrorism and Financial Crimes at the US Treasury Department, where he was one of the architects of the financial pressure campaign on the Maduro regime. So a range of perspectives. I'm very pleased to have you all with me today. Ryan, I wondered if you could just kick us off by talking a bit about the nature and scale of criminalization of the Venezuelan state that's happened under Maduro and what some of the implications of that are.
Well, thanks very much, Nate, for this invitation. It's great to be here on a wonderful panel, and thanks for giving attention, thanks to Hudson for giving attention to Venezuela. There's a lot of stuff going on in the world right now. Venezuela is extremely important, and I don't think it's getting the attention that it deserves, especially at the moment we're in now, which is to say a moment where, in the past we would have been criticizing the opposition for doing X, Y, Z or for not doing X, Y, Z. If we actually take stock of where we're at, the opposition has done remarkable things in the last couple months, including managing to get all of the actas, the vote tabulations from the centers, put them up on a website, have them QR coded so that they're two-step authorized. Independent experts who have looked at this have said these are legitimate actas, and make sure that the world has proof that Maduro has, in fact, stolen this election. And so, there's been really remarkable progress. And then on the other hand, as you mentioned in your remarks, we saw the very predictable Maduro regime repressing this weekend and forcibly exiling in my opinion, the president-elect of Venezuela, Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia, who won by a ratio of more than 2 to 1. And so your question about a hybrid criminalized state, I think, is the right one, Nate, because the question for some of us analysts is, how has the regime managed to hold together such cohesion under so much pressure, where the theft is apparent for everyone to see? And if you're looking at the security forces in the country, you're really asking the question, how is it that they're able to stand on the side of someone who clearly lost the election, right? And the answer to that, of course, is the opportunity for criminal activity, the opportunity for corruption, and the size and the scale of the illicit economy in Venezuela is the answer. And part of what the sanctions architecture that we've put around Venezuela is meant to do is to increase the costs of that criminal activity. It's meant to shut down some of that criminal activity, make it more difficult to engage in, and to punish those who are engaged in it. But clearly there's not enough deterrence there by the current administration in order to make any sort of the criminal nature of the security forces crack. And that's why I think we've seen them stand by the Maduro regime's side, even as the emperor has no clothes. I think we can say now that Maduro is fully unclothed. This regime will.
Image,
it's not a nice image, but it's the image that the opposition has given us, and they've done it brilliantly, I would say.
Yeah.
Literally, this regime does not exist on anything more than brute force and a criminalized nature within the government. And it's clear that they're going to exist only on brute force. I mean, Maduro has made this entirely clear with his Operation Knock Knock, going door to door, increasing repression. He's even reshuffled his cabinet to try to look like a more normal government. Who has he put in charge of internal, in the internal ministry or in charge of internal security? Is Diosdado Cabello, who's not the most stable individual in the world and is certainly one of the more radical elements of Chavismo. So this is all going in the direction of more repression and more criminality. And unfortunately, I think that's the basis upon which Maduro expects to be able to survive this moment in time when he's been basically caught red-handed or caught with his hand in the cookie jar, whatever metaphor you'd like to use. And literally he has no longer any basis left to continue to rule. Meanwhile, he's focused heavily on creating facts on the ground. He's focused heavily on making sure that people come around eventually to the idea that he controls the levers of power, that his people are in a position to call the shots, and that no political transition will start. It's 2 p.m. on Monday, the weekend after Edmundo González Urrutia was forcibly exiled, and we still don't have any announcement from the Biden administration about any forms of pressure that they're going to bring to bear, even insofar as individual sanctions on this regime. And so I'll finish my opening remarks by saying I don't have a good sense of where U.S. policy is going and what we would be willing to do. And that's a major problem at this point, because the opposition has performed so well, and yet U.S. policy hasn't been there alongside them to kind of give them the succor and support that they need to withstand this level of repression and to continue, going out in the streets and doing what they're doing, which is to demand that their vote be counted.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Lots to come back to there, I think. But Maria Alejandra, I wondered if you want to add anything, general reflections, but also talk a bit about the work that INREV is doing to try
Yes, well, you have
back what you
described
can
it
for
very well.
Venezuelan
But
people, right?
first of all, thank you, Nate, for the opportunity also to bring forward the case of Venezuela and what's going on, because definitely there is a lot at stake. And I need to point out that the consequence of all this has been, because it's been going on for 25 years. This is not only starting in July 28th. And it has resulted in almost 8 million Venezuelans, creating a migration crisis in the continent. And the saddest part of it is, of course, the toll on the population and the whole situation of the human rights. And just to bring forward the information that was collected by the United Nations fact-finding mission that could establish who is a torturer, where the orders come from for the violation of all these crimes. And this is the motivation we've had as Venezuelan Americans to participate and to try to help in what we can and bring some justice in this vast amount of resources that have been stolen. It is estimated that in these 25 years, between $300 to $500 billion have been stolen from the national treasury. It doesn't include illegal traffic of gold or gasoline or drugs. This is just the money that was supposed to go to service the Venezuelan people. We're talking about, just imagine, $300 to $500 billion. Currently, after the work of Transparencia Venezuela, we can now know that there are 255 cases being prosecuted all over the world in 30 countries against Venezuelan corrupt politicians. And these 255 cases amount for $70 billion stolen. It's just insane. In this context, the US is the country that is prosecuting the most cases outside of Venezuela. And currently, there are 60 cases against Venezuelan corrupt politicians. In those 60 cases, Weve, in alliance with Transparency Venezuela, has been able to determine that there are forfeiture orders for $3.7 billion. And our work since the last 4 years has been trying to push for the creation of a special fund to protect and eventually utilize this money to help the Venezuelan people. We've been advocating in Congress, and the last period we managed to have 2 bills in both the Senate and the House, and now it was reintroduced at the end of last year in the Senate, and we're working to have it hopefully passed for the creation of this special fund. It is very important that this, not only that the fund is created, but that these assets are protected from creditors. Because if you remember, not only Maduro has been caught with the hands in the cookie jar, but he's spent this money and stopped paying creditors since 2016, I believe. So Venezuela hasn't paid any bills since then. You probably can point at that better. But the truth is, what we want to put forward is that although these claims are, of course, legitimate and need to be honored, in the situation that Venezuela is currently, we believe the Venezuelan population should go first in how that we use this money. And in any case, there are assets belonging to the republic that could be used for this purpose. So we definitely believe that this money can be used for good, and there is precedent. There is already the Ukrainian support fund that is using money forfeited from corruption to help Ukrainians. And there have been other cases in which the US has been able to come up with creative ideas on how to return this money. And it is important because the type of regime that Venezuela is uses the law and the rules to weaken democracy and destroy it. So although we need to follow the rules and respect the rule of law, we have to create new ways to be able to counteract. So that's basically our work and what I would like to put.
Could you just explain quickly before we go to Marshall, what happens to that money at the moment that gets forfeited?
It's just, well, it depends.
In the absence of a special fund, where is it going?
It depends on where in the stage of the case, but the cases that have completely finished, like in the case of Alejandro Andrade, the famous Chavez treasurer, the assets had been auctioned and the money is just in treasury.
It's sitting in the general sort of forfeiture funds where all the money that gets forfeited by the US government goes. Okay, great, thank you. Marshall, any reflections to share with us?
Well, it's great to be with you here and to, I think, meet you for the first time.
Yes.
And the important work that you're doing. The United States needs a Latin America policy. We don't have one. We haven't had one under this administration. And that policy needs to operate on the basis of an understanding that at the heart of much that is going wrong in Latin America is Venezuela. It's dirty Venezuelan money that has underpinned elections in Brazil, Colombia, Mexico. It's dirty Venezuelan money that is, and oil that is propping up the Cuban regime, the Nicaraguan regime, who, by the way, we want to talk about no attention being given is the atrocities in Nicaragua. Resolving the Maduro problem needs to be front and center for the United States. This is our hemisphere. We live here too. And we suffer the consequences of a regime of a narco regime, of a drug cartel that sits on top of the world's largest oil deposits, the 4th largest gold deposits, who has systematically plundered the country bare, who has turned a country that had, by far and away in South America, the best educated, truly the highest human capital in Latin America, into a destitute country, an impoverished country with 8 million Venezuelans fleeing. Now, just wait. I would expect that that number will dramatically increase. Rather than issuing broad and vague condemnations of Maduro for not only stealing the election, but the extrajudicial killings. We've all seen the videos of them shooting into the crowds. The effort, the fact that they've disappeared multiple members of the opposition of Maria Corina's own direct staff, that they are targeting her, that they forced the president-elect to flee. The United States needs to do a couple of things. First, then this is obvious, is actually reimposing and enforcing the Trump administration sanctions and going further, particularly going further to tell Chevron to get out. That's something that I wish we had been able to do in the Trump administration that needs to happen now. During the Trump administration, we worked very, very closely with a number of our partners and allies to impose multilateral sanctions on the Venezuelan regime. We worked in particular very closely with the Trudeau government, and in many cases, Canada actually led the way with some of the sanctions imposed on regime leadership. Likewise, we collaborated very, very closely with, at the time, the Weve, the financial intelligence units across the region, whether it's Mexico, Panama, Argentina, Colombia, to track down these assets, and particularly focusing on the use of the CLAP program to exert social control through the threat of starvation, which is just outrageous. Of course, what did Biden do? He released the ringleader of that entire horrible effort, Alex Saab, back into Venezuela. We need to see a resumption of that multilateral push. We need to see the Biden administration the Biden-Harris administration in their few final days, re-engage with the Canadians, re-engage with the Argentinians, re-engage with the European Union. One of the things that the Biden administration has done fairly well relative to Putin's further invasion of Ukraine, was mobilizing the European Union to go after Russian assets, to go after and to sanction Russian entities, individuals, and so on. We need to see the European Union step up, in particular the Spanish. The Spanish and the European Union need to step up and begin imposing those types of sanctions on the Venezuelan regime to make it clear to European subsidiaries that they're not going to operate with impunity in Venezuela anymore, to make clear to Maduro that the money that he has stashed, that his thugs have stashed in Spain, but Bulgaria, many other places, is not safe. I was disappointed to see the Vatican present credentials to Maduro. I'd like to hear the Vatican come clean about what kind of Venezuelan money has washed through their bank. What kind of Venezuelan money is still sitting in the Vatican? The Biden administration ought to double the reward on Maduro from 15 million to 30 million and make clear the reward is for dead or alive. We need to play hardball with this regime. These are killers. This is not just a kleptocracy, but it is a vicious one. And there need to be consequences. Thanks, Nick.
No, thank you, Marshall. Lots to think about there. That would be a very different approach indeed. I wanted to come back, Ryan, to you, if that's okay. Because you talked about all these different constituencies that Maduro has to sort of balance and cobble together, to maintain power, like the security services, but then he's also got these criminal gangs and so with the sort of future sanctions regime, is there any sort of scope there for upsetting one of those groups, for driving divisions? Because I sort of think when I look at Maduro, his claim to power has been sadly quite consolidated at this point. He's also been quite desperate at times. And are there opportunities to sort of drive a wedge anywhere?
Indeed, quite desperate. We have Christmas coming on October 1st in Venezuela, right? He's moved forward Christmas. So my point about brute force alone is right. I mean, he's got brute force. He's got Christmas on October 1st, right? I mean, that's literally what this regime is hanging on at the moment. I mean, look, we've been we've been trying for years now to try to to find the right architecture of sanctions to try to open the security forces. Unfortunately, neither set of sanctions has managed to do that. I mean, I think the problem for me, the challenge is Maduro doesn't have an infinite ability to repress. No regime does. You can have a lot of ability to repress, and you can certainly feed the repressive apparatus with a lot of resources that we are actually engaging in. Marshall mentioned Chevron's activities in Venezuela. There's also European companies that are in Venezuela. Venezuela is pumping more oil today than it did under sanctions relief when the Barbados Agreement was in effect. Right? Before our snapback in April of this year, Venezuela was producing anywhere between 7 and 750, let's say ballpark figure, 1,000 barrels of oil per day. It's now producing 850 or so, close to 900,000. It's the most it's produced in 4 years. Soon, many expect it will hit the 1 million mark, either by the end of this year or early in next year, right? And yet we've snapped back sanctions. So we are contributing to the feeding of this repressive apparatus. That's step number one. Step number two would be finding the right combination of sanctions, both sectoral and individual, to try to reduce the amount of resources in that repressive apparatus. Again, it's not an infinite amount of resources that Maduro has to feed that apparatus. It's vast. It's a lot. It's unfortunately the reality. But it's not infinite, right? He can't completely repress his way out of every nightmare he's created for himself. The problem is when we inadvertently feed that because we are scared of consequences that I don't think we should be scared of. Usually, Nate, what you hear is two counterpoints to the reimposition of sanctions, and especially the kind of sectoral sanctions that Marshall mentioned, and I don't think either one of them is really very persuasive. The first is the concern that China, Russia, Iran, or other strategic adversaries will somehow get a foothold if we tell European and American companies that they should close up shop in Venezuela. Folks, Maduro has chosen the path of totalitarianism, right? He has chosen the path of tyranny. His bed is made. At this point, strategy's job shouldn't be to try to keep China, Russia, Iran away from Venezuela. Venezuela is firmly in their clutches. As Marshall said, there's no point in strategy trying to kind of tiptoe around so that we make sure that Maduro doesn't somehow go further into Russia's hands. That is his survival card, right? He's already played that, and he's going to continue playing it. The second point that a lot of folks often make to the kind of sectoral sanctions that Marshall and I would advocate for is the migration concern, right? If we go back to a moment where we have tough sectoral sanctions, particularly on the oil sector, to try to reduce the amount of money going into this repressive apparatus, we're going to inadvertently contribute to outmigration. Well, if you looked at the polls that were done by several reputable polling firms before the election on July 28th, people were saying that if Maduro stayed in office, they were going to leave. About 40% of people said, I will consider picking up and leaving, including a fair number of them who said they would leave even before his inauguration next year on January 10th. So my message to the folks who worry about that would be, it's not about economic opportunity or lack thereof. It's about regime type. It's about not being able to live in freedom, and also la falta de esperanza, as we would say in Spanish, just the lack of hope. The idea that this guy would stay for another 6 years generates a lack of hope. And an idea that repression is just going to continue from now until when he leaves office, that generally gets people to up and leave far more, in my opinion, than the lack of economic opportunities.
Marshall, I don't know if you had any more to add on that point. Ryan was
I agree with it, but I would actually maybe suggest it's not an inadvertent Biden administration policy to let the Venezuelan oil flow. In their quest to decarbonize the United States, the Biden administration has proven quite happy to have people buy oil from despots around the world. Just look at the fact that they've walked away from sanctions on Iran, from enforcement of those sanctions. They've refused to sanction Russian oil exports. They've allowed this tripling of Venezuelan oil exports. There hasn't been a single Venezuelan tanker seized, to my knowledge, under the Biden administration. We did. We engaged in multiple efforts to pursue and seize assets. The seizure of the plane was good, but they were already going to go after
There's
it.
another one, Marshall, as you know.
Yeah, yeah. And let's also be clear that, again, back to the fact that this is kind of the den of vipers in Latin America, Iran is there. They've brought the Iranians in wholesale. Hezbollah is there, is operating out of Venezuela. I mean, there was a plot to abduct an Iranian-American citizen and to smuggle her, presumably for torture and execution into Iran. They were going to smuggle her. First stop was Venezuela. That's how comfortable Iran is operating in that country. The Russians are there. Maduro is propped up by a Praetorian Guard of Cubans, not Venezuelans, who are armed with the very best intelligence that the Russian services can provide. At the end of the day, he's got to go. He's got to go by one method or another.
How would you all rate the sort of regional response and U.S. engagement with other countries around Venezuela that are having to deal with this neighbor? I think Brazil is now holding talks with Maduro, for example, that is not perhaps helpful in terms of legitimizing him. How can the U.S. better engage other countries in the region if it were to take a stronger line, as you both suggest? How would it take other countries in the region along with that, given the sometimes difficult relations that we have with many of them? That might be a big question.
I don't think you can count on politicians who were bankrolled in their election campaigns by dirty Venezuelan money to be credible interlocutors.
That's fair.
I think the time is also now long past for us to try to lead from behind on this matter. We need to lead from the front. But we do have other partners. Milei has been fantastic. The Argentinians have been fantastic. The Costa Ricans, the Panamanians, there are a number of countries that have stepped up to show that this is intolerable. But in addition, I've said we need the Canadians. Where are the Canadians? I'd like to really hear from the Canadian government because in the past they've been very good on this. But what we really need is the European Union. The Brits are fantastic. The Brits are still sitting on the monetary gold that the Bank of England has, despite multiple efforts to free that gold up. But we need the rest of the European Union to really signal that you don't get to vacation. You don't get to visit your yachts and your private property in Europe anymore. There have to be real consequences. Final point, the old saying, there is no honor among thieves. And let's be clear, this is a band of thieves. During the Trump administration, the infighting spiked because the money and the goodie train was drying up. And they were going at each other. And you just have to look back at the friction with Diosdado, at the friction with Tariq and others, as they began to square off over who was going to continue to reap the majority of the benefits. But now they're flush with cash again. And that infighting has really died down. Just the fact that Diosdado's been rehabilitated by Maduro, which I'm sure was not of his doing. I'm sure he was directed by the Russians and the Cubans to do this. But that tells you something.
If I can just add, Nate, on this, I think we've lost precious time, unfortunately, right? As Marshall said, leading from behind, letting Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, to a lesser extent, take the lead. Look, folks, these countries haven't even managed to get Maduro on a Zoom call, right? I'm sorry to say it as plainly as that, but those are the plain facts, right? We've been waiting for a long time for them to just try to get a call with Maduro. He won't take the call. Right, and if you look numerically, we've got more countries in the region that support the Declaration of Santo Domingo, 22 plus the European Union, which was a very strong statement of principles that said that Edmundo was the rightful winner of the election and that the repression needs to stop and a dialogue about a transition needs to begin forthwith. Numerically, we're a way higher number of countries that want to play around that set of goals than the number of countries like Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico who want to try to get Maduro on a Zoom call to say who knows what. But I think if you want to talk about leading, I understand there are some concerns people in this town will lose Brazil, will lose Colombia, but numerically speaking, we've got more countries behind us for a stronger approach, and I think that approach was clearly embodied in the Santo Domingo Declaration.
If I may,
yeah, of course.
The international response from the democratic world is being amazingly coordinated in the case of Venezuela, so it's something that needs to be acknowledged. And also the fact that sanctions definitely at this point, and this is a situation that Maduro has created, is the only resource that the international community have to try to push some change. But it's also important to remember that, that the sanctions provide leverage, but they also have an impact. And I still have family in Venezuela, so that what you mentioned before about the right measure and the right purpose of the sanctions needs to be taken into account, because it definitely has the effect of affecting those in power, but it has to be the right amount and the right mix, because it's not the reason why the Venezuelans are in the economic situation that we are right now, but it will definitely contribute. So it's something to take to consider.
Yeah. Yeah, Maria, Alejandro, I wanted to come back to you and talk a bit about some of the assets, because I think those are, I wasn't aware of those figures. I think those are probably some new research that you've done there. So that's really fascinating, and thank you again for the work that INRAB is doing in shining a light on just the extent of the kleptocracy, but also potentially our power to safeguard and shepherd those resources for better future use than that to which they were going to be put by Venezuelan kleptocrats. So one of the sort of arguments that you get against the fund, this idea for a special dedicated fund, is that it can actually have a counterproductive effect in terms of suddenly Venezuelans will look at the US and they'll say, hey, they've got all this money. This is our money. Why don't they just send it back now? And then actually, rather than being angry at the regime that stole the money in the first place, they'll be angry at the country that seized it and is holding on to it for them. Do you think that could be the case? And also, there's the issue of the money rightfully belongs to the Venezuelan people, potentially to a future Venezuelan government, which may want to put it for slightly different. They may want to build a highway with it or something rather than use it for humanitarian purposes now. How do you how do you deal with that question of who should actually control, who should get access to the fund in the end, and how?
Well, it is a great question, because it would be, for me, I think, hard to find a Venezuelan that wants these assets or this money to go back to any Venezuelan government. And when I say any, it's not because of any, it is based on a real fact that the Venezuelan institutions are dismantled. So even in the event of a democratic transition, that is what we all want, the institutions are not ready to handle anything with accountability, with transparency, and the possibilities that this money is going to get stolen again. So the usual paths of asset return do not apply to Venezuela. First, the US doesn't recognize the Maduro government since 2019. But even if the Maduro government were recognized, I cannot imagine of any US official signing an authorization to send money there. And I believe Venezuelans would be the first to appreciate the fact that this money can be managed in a transparent way, in which the civic society can have some oversight and some opinion on what's going on. And that type of transparency cannot be achieved in Venezuela right now, no matter what happens. And because the reconstructions of institutions in Venezuela is going to take a while. And I think every Venezuelan knows that the government steals money. So I don't think it's going to be a hard sell. I mean, it's pretty obvious. So the fact that that money can go back to be of good, I think it will be widely appreciated. Yes.
That's great. So, Marshall, you sort of mentioned, we're a few months out from a presidential election here in the US. I think we've sort of been over what the Biden-Harris administration has and hasn't done, mostly by the sound of it. You've given us sort of your view, but do you have a view, like what shape a Trump Latin America or Venezuela policy might take? Would it be broadly something similar to what you outlined, or from what
I wouldn't be so bold.
No, sure. I wouldn't ask you to second guess him, but
I mean, his policy was pretty clear, and the pressure campaign that he directed us to mount against Maduro was also very clear, and you saw how we approached the issue. But I mean, remember that he hosted Juan Guaido and his wife at the State of the Union address. President Trump was very focused, probably one of the more Western Hemisphere focused presidents that we've had in quite a while. And I think that you would see that focus return in a future Trump administration for the better. You know, I think you know, we had the Biden administration applauding the victory of socialists in Brazil and Colombia and other places. I don't think that you would have such a vociferous applause in a future Trump administration.
Suppose, you know, in the next few years, it seems like it's going the other way, unfortunately, but there is some kind of transition of power in Venezuela. Either, as we hope, a democratic transition, or, you know, some kind of a coup or something, you know, from within the current power structure. I guess, Ryan, is Maduro, is he the kind of, is he the thief in chief? Is there are there obvious successors? Is the system built around him? I'm just thinking if there is democratic transition, you know, what you often have is the new people come in, but then the underlying, as you were saying, Maria Alejandra, you know, the rot in the institutions is still there, and you know, short of a kind of de-Baathification kind of process, which isn't really possible, you know, in countries with vulnerable institutions that struggle to do their job anyway. What would is Maduro replaceable, I suppose, and what would happen if, you know, if he was out doing a rally and someone put a bullet in him or something, you know, for whatever personal reason, something like that.
Look, these are some complicated scenarios. I think you're outlining two different types of transition. You mentioned a democratic transition where there's actually a negotiation, where the regime decides to initiate a conversation about, you know, safe off-ramps and you know, transitional justice and all of that. I think many of us would perhaps like to see a more orderly transition in Venezuela, but I don't think any of us are holding our breath for an orderly transition in Venezuela, because Maduro doesn't strike me as the kind of guy who's going to willingly give up power. And that, you know, that's part of the challenge of the approach that we've seen from the Biden administration, is that a lot of it was predicated upon some kind of crack in the security structure, some kind of opening sort of further below Maduro in the top circle that wants to cling to power no matter what, to try to find some of those off-ramps. So I think the scenario that you outlined, unfortunately, is a bit more likely, which is that there's some kind of competition within the authoritarian hierarchies of Chavismo, and certainly, as Marshall has outlined, there are no shortage of villains and thieves and anti-heroes and all sorts of other types of individuals in that circle. So is he replaceable? Yes, I believe he's replaceable, unfortunately, because that's a criminal structure, right? It's a criminal structure, it's a firm criminal structure around Maduro, and so the next person up will step in and will be subject to the same criminal hierarchy as Maduro runs at the moment. So the unfortunate answer is, if we do get to a democratic transition, we're going to have to think very carefully about how we decriminalize some of those structures that exist within the state, because it's not simply about the individual, as evil and as nasty as he might be. Maria Alejandra, you mentioned the Transparency International report on Venezuela. If I'm not mistaken, that report made an estimate that 20% of Venezuela's economy is illicit.
Yes, correct.
Right? That was one of the top line findings of the report. 20%. It's $1 out of every $5 in that economy, right? So it's a significant amount of decriminalization that's going to happen, structures within the government. It's not simply a matter of Maduro going away, much as we'd like to see him, you know, go away. It's about a much more purposive strategy that goes deeper than just the guy at the top.
I mean, Maduro is quite replaceable. This is a bus driver who thought it was a good idea to do an hour of salsa and eat empanadas. He was going to cure all of Venezuela's ills by handing out free rabbits. And instead of eating the rabbits, the Venezuelan people adopted them as pets. The issue is more what kind of infighting erupts within Cartel de las Sols and the other power structures, because his removal, none of these other arch villains are necessarily positioned to easily take over completely. But I mean, let's be clear. The power behind the throne here is El Combatante, right? His wife. She's the brains of the operation. It's certainly not Maduro.
I had a good question. What was it? Sorry, everyone. I'll come back to it. I wondered, as I've actually got some guests here today, if anyone had any questions of their own they wanted to put their hand up. We don't need a mic. If I can just repeat the question for the if anyone has any comments. No? That's okay. Well, I guess we're coming to sort of 45 minutes. I usually run over, but you've all been so succinct and so excellent at putting what needs to be done. That was actually, I do have one final question, which is about this rising issue of sort of transnational repression we're seeing by the Maduro regime, which I think it's always probably done to some extent, but it does seem to be going into sort of fever pitch, certainly post the presidential election. Are the measures you've all outlined about putting pressure on the Maduro regime, would that be part of how we deter that transnational repression, those activities here on US soil sometimes, trying to, and certainly across the Latin America region, wherever political dissidents are found, they now find themselves pursued, not just online by trolls, but in their hotel rooms by armed thugs. And I think from what I've seen, this is often carried out again by gang members, and it's closely bound up with the sort of organized crime element of the Maduro regime. Are there separate things that we can do to address this issue of transnational repression when it occurs outside of Venezuela? Or do you think that sort of package that you've sort of been talking about today of generally strengthening and replacing and enhancing sanctions and enforcement, that would be sort of part of how we deal with that?
You want me to go first?
Sure.
Well, look, one of your questions was about how we can approach this in the future. And look, if we don't get the indications of some kind of transition, in the next couple months, there's of course January 10th of next year, which is another moment where Maduro will create more facts on the ground. Right, he'll inaugurate himself after his stolen election, and it will be yet harder even to begin any kinds of talks about an off-ramp for him or to induce cracks within the regime that could lead to a transition. So by the time the next U.S. president gets into office, Maduro may be thinking in his mind, I'm sailing to another 6 years. And if it does look, in fact, in early 2025 as though the moment for a democratic transition is not as auspicious as we would have hoped, I do think that the next government has to transition to a policy that I would consider to be more a policy of containment, as Marshall was talking about. I don't want Maduro interfering in elections through illicit finance in neighboring countries. I don't want Maduro to have the ability to engage in transnational repression by directing the Tren de Aragua to assassinate Ronald Ojeda in Chile. I don't want Maduro to be able to launder his illicit gold through Nicaragua, layering it essentially into Nicaraguan mines and saying that it's a Nicaraguan product, and also providing the Daniel Ortega regime with some kind of survival and resilience. So all of these things, I think, and I could continue going on, I think we want to try to keep them as wrapped up in Venezuela as possible and prevent those criminal tentacles from going as far as they do at the moment. The best way I can encapsulate that kind of strategy is by saying containment, although there are historians in the room who would probably question me on that because it's got a sort of Cold War legacy to it. But I think you've got to keep him as closely wrapped up as possible and make sure that there's not as much fallout for the region as we've seen thus far in terms of the spillover effects of Venezuela and Latin America, which I think Marshall mentioned very well in his opening remarks.
Well, I would also say that the process that has started with the primaries and then the election shows that the civic fabric of Venezuela is very much alive. And I think one of the objectives of future policy should be to help this civic fiber to keep being alive and active. In Venezuela, there are about 200 civic society organizations that do the groundwork for all the amazing things we saw happening this last month. Is because there are people risking their lives every day. And I think that needs to be part of the focus because you can contain, but also I'm pretty sure the whole process of the election and how the information on the voting was disclosed, it wasn't easy for the regime to swallow. And that can only happen with a vibrant society. And I think that should be really one of the priorities in the future.
And it's under threat by the NGO
Oh,
law.
by the NGO law, yes, which is a piece of law that is basically criminalizing civic society organizations and actually hindering them from acting. It's the amount of requisites that civic society organizations have to fulfill. It's almost impossible. But even when they want to, the government just doesn't answer. So you're always outside of the law. So it's going to be a harder environment to operate.
Do you think the fund that you propose could funds like could be
Definitely.
used to help keep civil society alive, even if it's outside
Oh
of
yeah,
Venezuela?
I think so. Even in the text of the bill, it is included the strengthening of the civic society organization. So it's something that we have advocated for.
That's great. Well, I wish you the best of luck with the fund. Michael, any final thoughts as we're just hitting
I
time?
think on the transnational repression question, the alignment of the Sabine with the Cuban intelligence services, the Russians, the Iranians, and Hezbollah should be very concerning to us. And we need to understand that over the past almost 4 years, there's been a massive influx of Venezuelan organized criminal groups into the United States, and we've seen that in recent days in Colorado. The Iranians in particular like to use proxies for their dirty work. Just look at the fact that it was a Pakistani who was arrested for attempting to assassinate President Trump and other senior former Trump officials. So we should be concerned not just about the Venezuelan regime's use of these criminal groups and these gangs. We should be concerned that they may actually serve as a proxy for other equally vicious and equally hostile regimes. Again, I come back to the fact that you can't lay all of Latin America's ills at the feet of the Venezuelans, the Venezuelan regime, I should say. But you can certainly ascribe to Maduro and Chavismo many of the problems that we're dealing with now.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. We've just come up to time. So I want to thank you all. I'm not a Latin America expert, but I do think the case of Venezuela is just one of the most tragic tales of the impact and the terror that unchecked corruption growing into full-blown kleptocracy can produce. So we at the Kleptocracy Initiative do like to come back to Venezuela and keep the focus on it and hear from folks like you who really know what you're talking about. So thank you so much for your time, Ryan and Maria Alejandra, for coming to Hudson. Thank you again, as always, Marshall, for joining me. And thank you to everyone who joined us online and in person today. We look forward to welcoming you all back soon, hopefully with some better news on the Venezuela front.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.